Okay, so we've started the recording already, right? Okay.
Yes.
So welcome to our workshop. We're from the Counseling Center, and my name is Gayatri Titus, and I'm going to be presenting with my colleague here, Blake, and the workshop is on self-care for social justice advocates, and we are very happy that you could join us today, and we are going to get started.
And before we get started with all of our workshops, we think it's important to just review some informed consent. That way you know what you're getting into and what this presentation is and what it's not. So note that some content discussed in the presentation may be overwhelming or distressing. That is not our intent. However, if you need, feel free to take a break or leave the presentation to take care of yourself in whatever way that works well for you. This presentation, as well as our other workshops through the Counseling Center, are intended to be psychoeducational, and they're not a substitute for mental health services or emergency response. We encourage you to visit our website or give us a call to learn more about the supports that we're offering to students currently. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, such as active thoughts of suicide, you can give us a call or visit our website to read more about the emergency resources. You can also call local emergency responders, and just be aware that those resources may be different based on your location. And as I've mentioned earlier, this workshop is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube account as well as other online platforms. And only the presenter's video will be shared in this recording. So at the end, I will stop the recording before we leave the presentation. And we're gonna take a moment to pause for about 30 to 40 seconds just to give space to review our response to the race-related violence, as well as the recent tragic events in our country. And so it is our hope that during these events that you know that we are available to provide support, and we will talk a little bit about our services at the end of this presentation. And to get started, being a college student is already pretty challenging. Being a human being is already pretty challenging. As a college student, there's an adjustment period every semester, every year to college life and being on campus, or just adjusting to having a different routine, living with different people. And there's assignments, there's pressures to choose a major, career path. Our relationships change. Maybe the relationships with people we had back home can change, as well as the friendships or romantic relationships we have in college. Lots of changes going on. Some college students find themselves working in order to provide some financial support for themselves, and that's an additional stressor. And then you think about bills, time management. There's just a lot of things going on, and you think about like each of those things being maybe a stress ball, and you're just juggling a lot of those things. So life in general is already pretty stressful.
So we already have the stressors that Blake has just shared with us. And so on top of these stressors, people with minoritized identities can experience additional stressors. They can have experiences with discrimination or racism, something that probably people experience on their daily life, microaggressions, insensitive comments, maybe sometimes questions about what are they doing on this college campus. So in addition to the stresses that already we face as a student, it's important to be mindful that when you have a minoritized identity or multiple minority identities, you experience several more layers of stress in addition. So in our presentation, we also want to introduce the concept of wellness and how we can try to cope with the stressors of life. So the concept of wellness here was developed by SAMHSA, and in their concept, what they envision is where wellness is not the absence of stress or the absence of illness, because that is part of life. But wellness is influenced by these 8 dimensions and what we can do in either of these dimensions or all of these or some of these to experience better wellness in our life. So the 8 dimensions are, the first one is emotional. So on the emotional continuum of this dimension, it talks about how we can cope with life and create more satisfying relationships. The next one is environmental. So how can we feel better about ourselves in the environments that we live in and what changes we can make in that environment to achieve that. The third one is financial. So this refers to our wellness that comes from the sense of being okay with our current and financial situation. And if we're not okay, then what are some things we can do to help that? The next one is intellectual. So this is about recognizing our abilities and finding ways to expand our knowledge and skills. Then we have the occupational dimension of wellness, and this refers to the personal satisfaction and enrichment that we get from our work or our careers. The next one is the physical dimension of wellness, and this refers to our area of sleep and nutrition, the food that we put in our bodies, our physical activities that we engage in. The seventh one is social. So the social dimension refers to how we connect with other people, our sense of belonging, how do we feel supported by the systems that we live in or that are around us. And finally, the 8th dimension is spiritual. And in this dimension, we are looking at our sense of purpose, our meaning in life, and where we derive that from. So life has changed dramatically. As we know, a few months ago, we were out about as usual, and then we had COVID-19. And the impact of COVID-19 has been pretty dramatic. It has affected so many areas in our lives. So the first one is our physical and environmental sense of safety and security. Our health concerns have been affected, our daily habits, our daily routines. We have to spend time at home. We have to practice physical distancing, which wasn't there before. So there has been a lot of uncertainty regarding, our sense of safety, and that's how COVID-19 has impacted all our lives and increased our stress so much more than what we would go through if we were students going through the academic stressors. The next way I think that COVID-19 has impacted us is on the academic level. So we are not meeting in person, classes were moved online, our services were moved online, and things very quickly had to adapt, where students had to adapt to just not seeing people in person. And that has been a big stressor, a big adjustment that everybody has to sort of get used to. In social terms, we have also been impacted because we are not able to meet our friends freely. It's been stressful on our relationships. Our support systems have been challenged. We have had to change how we travel, what kind of parties or hangouts we have with people. That has changed. A lot of our person-to-person interactions have moved onto Zoom meetings, which is not the same. COVID-19 has also impacted us on an emotional level. So for a lot of us, we are experiencing more anxiety, fear, frustration. There's a lot of grief over things that we used to do that we cannot do anymore. There's a lot of uncertainty in our lives, and that has increased our stress levels. And then also in a spiritual sense, a lot of us are trying to make sense of what's going on. How do we cope with this? Is this going to end? When is this going to end? And there are a lot of questions that have not been answered. How we all practice our faiths or our spirituality has also been challenged, where we can't do the things that we used to do or meet the people we used to meet. And then last but not the least, it has also impacted our occupational and financial ways of being. A lot of people have struggled to keep their jobs. A lot of people have lost their jobs. You know, even financially, it's been hard. So sort of the context has changed dramatically. And when we look at, you know, the work we do as advocates for people, it's hard and it's challenging on us because all this has taken a toll on all human beings.
When thinking about how COVID-19 has impacted us, it's important to think about intersectionality. Earlier we talked about how minoritized identities can experience additional and unique layers of stress. And so within the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been disparities that have been even more recognized and acknowledged in our country. And so some things to consider are our socioeconomic status and how certain industries are considered essential, and these industries often result in having a higher exposure to the risk of COVID-19. And then there's access or barriers to healthcare, and this could be related to finances or the fear of discrimination. More specifically, there are populations that have been uniquely and differently impacted by COVID-19. And so we know that the Black community, as well as the Hispanic and Latinx community, have had high numbers of COVID-19, and there are many reasons that can be connected to this in terms of structural barriers that might increase exposure to COVID-19, as well as access to healthcare. And the same goes for the LGBTQIA+ community. So the Human Rights Campaign did a study and showed that a lot of people within this community have entertainment or restaurant associated jobs, and those are connected to higher exposure risk. And then we think about the Native American community within our country, and the difficulties to accessing healthcare or economic advantages within our country. And even those that have predisposing risk factors, medical concerns, those increase the likelihood of experiencing COVID-19. And so thinking about each of these specific populations and the structural systems that are in place in our country that add pressure and stress already. We know that stress makes us even more vulnerable to the pandemic.
And I just wanted to add also, Blake, the things that we were talking about where people don't have access to running water, or they have to live in crowded homes, and it's hard to practice physical distancing. It's hard to wash your hands because you don't just have access to running water, and that impacts their risk factors as well.
Right, that's a good point.
So thank you for that, Blake. I'm going to spend a little time discussing the impact of racial trauma in our society. So as we know, the last couple of months have been overwhelming with things that we've been reading in the media, you know, social media, where we're Facebook, there's WhatsApp, there's news, and we're aware of all these incidents that have happened that are very heartbreaking. Um, and we also want to acknowledge that there has been a history of systemic racism and oppression that has continued for many, many years, and these systems continue to exist today. So what we see here has not necessarily happened in a vacuum. There's a context here that needs to be acknowledged. We have also witnessed incarceration of people that are from specific groups. With stories, and we've seen in the social media stories about Black individuals or African American families that sort of have a higher incidence of being incarcerated. Um, we also have learned a lot by what we have witnessed with people and interactions with the police through videos and through the protests that we have witnessed. We are learning about racial profiling, and every other day there's another story out there. We also want to acknowledge the microaggressions that people face, and it's something that builds over time. Things that you might experience at the grocery store, or things that you might experience at a post office, that you don't necessarily think that that's going to happen, but you might have an experience that says, wow, really. So we just want to bring this awareness, and discuss it, because this adds to so much stress when you are also an advocate for people, because you are experiencing these these narratives, these stories that people are experiencing, and you're experiencing it yourself as you're listening to these narratives. And that can cause secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, where you feel for people who suffer, you feel their pain, and you experience it, even though it's indirect, it's still experienced as a human being who cares for other human beings. And then we also want to, sort of share the concept of intersectionality. So when you're working with people that might belong to more than one minority group and have multiple identities from different minority groups, their experience of racial trauma is going to be different from somebody else who might not identify with those groups. So we need to be aware of all these different complexities that can sort of affect a person and how they experience racial trauma in our society.
Building off of that, I think it's important to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts our bodies and minds. So within our brain, we have the amygdala, hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, a lot of other pieces to the brain. But in terms of trauma, our amygdala is a structure in the brain that's always on the lookout for threats in our environment, so things that could cause us harm. And our hippocampus is responsible for coding those experiences in our memory and coding the context of those experiences. And so when the amygdala is activated and our body is recognizing something as being a threat or potentially being really stressful or to the traumatic level, there's smaller levels of trauma and there's bigger levels of trauma, much like a spectrum. And so when this happens, our bodies release stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And those stress hormones are supposed to help us respond in a way to protect ourselves or to navigate this situation. But what we know based on research is that over time, this can lead to structural changes in our brain. And it influences our prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making part of our brain. And so over time, trauma, whether it's complex trauma or single events, this can make it difficult to cope with challenges with stress and emotion regulation. And we might see trauma showing up in the body as difficulty with sleep, tension, memory and fatigue, hypervigilance, so being on the lookout for things, and difficulty making decisions. And those can sound like a lot of symptoms to a lot of other mental health concerns. So sometimes there can be some misunderstanding for how we might be responding to situations. And so it's important to recognize that and think about how these events that we're experiencing in our country can be traumatic in nature, and they can have an impact on our body and mind. And oftentimes people are familiar with the fight or flight reflex, but there's also the fawn and freeze reflex as well. And those are just different ways that our bodies respond to trauma and help us navigate those situations. And we also know that if you have pre-existing conditions, whether it's physical or medical, or even psychological, such as anxiety or depression, trauma can aggravate those and cause those concerns to stand out more, to be more difficult to cope with. And so as we talk about social justice and advocacy, it's important to think about how all of this can really have an impact on our mental wellness as well. And thinking about how we have COVID-19 as well as all these current cultural events going on in our country, it can create challenges in our growth and development. So we have the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the core of this pyramid, we have our basic needs. So safety and psychological needs. And with COVID-19, as well as the systemic racism within our country and the racial trauma that is happening in our country, and we can even extend that to other cultural traumas as well that are happening within our country, such as with the LGBTQIA community. And thinking about how these experiences shift our attention to the bottom part of the pyramid, and it can make it difficult for us to feel, to have our psychological needs met. So feeling like we belong, or to even feel good about ourselves. Sometimes there can be challenges there. And so along the way, it can really put a lot of barriers to being able to reach this self-actualization goal. And so with this pyramid, it's important that we focus on how we can meet these foundational needs while we have all of this stuff going on right now.
Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about this theory called the ecological theory. And this is a useful lens that can help us understand the impact of COVID-19, the impact of the racial trauma, or whatever other stressors that people might be experiencing when we try to help other people. So right at the center, we have the microsystem. And the microsystem refers to the immediate environment of college students, and it encompasses your family, your school, your peers, your religious affiliation, your workplace, your neighborhood. And at this level, and at this system, the microsystem, you can influence the system, and the system can influence you. So you have some control over that. And that's where coping happens, because you can make changes at that level. You can do things differently. The next system, as we go wider out to the circle, is the mesosystem. The mesosystem is made up of different microsystems interacting with each other. So for example, Blake has his own microsystem of his neighborhood and his school and his workplace. I have my own microsystem. Now these microsystems can engage each other. They can impact each other because we're all connected. And that is what we refer to as the mesosystem. The exosystem refers to a system that we don't have too much control with. And we are sort of at, they make these changes and then we are impacted by these changes. So that refers to the government, the education system, the political system, the systems that are making decisions about vaccines or cures. So these are things that we don't directly have influence over, but they influence our lives greatly. And then the next system, as you go out into the circle, is called the macro system. And the macro system refers to the culture, the values, the beliefs that we have grown up with that exist in our society. And then finally have the chrono system, which is a dimension of time that we live in. So this is a useful theory to look at, because with anything that affects us, it sort of also affects the people we work with, our families. It broadens out to the government, the education system. And so all of these are influencing each other. They're all impacting each other at the same time. And so this is a good lens to look at when you are trying to understand how something has impacted somebody's life or it has impacted your life.
I want to add that, like, with social justice advocacy, like how when we're advocating for change, maybe in those outer layers, that we might be shaking things up a little bit. We might be having to break through some of those barriers to create changes in those systems that we might normally not have control over.
Yeah, that's a great point, Blake. Right.
So, how does all this relate to social justice advocacy? We've been talking about COVID, we've been talking about cultural traumas, and we know that the work fighting for social justice is hard. We mentioned talking about breaking out of that microsystem and into the other systems to create changes. And again, we've talked about marginalization and how that creates even more layers of stress. And then for folks that have privileged identities or might identify as allies and that might be new to this work can be exhausting for them as well in a different way. And so thinking about how much work is happening and how this can be just pretty draining for our system. And so the fight for social justice exists within these layers of the ecological theory, as well as the hierarchy of needs. And so in order to support self-actualization and equity, we have to support people in being able to have their basic psychological and self-fulfillment needs met. And that involves work at each of those levels in our systems. And so talking about self-care with social justice advocates, one thing that comes to our mind is the importance of social relationships and how social relationships are our number one predictor of mental wellness. And of course, we have COVID-19 happening, and that's impacting our social relationships. It can make it difficult to really lean into our community systems right now. And so we know that we have the safe physical distancing recommendations of being 6 feet apart, having limited group numbers and wearing masks. That can, there's still this anxiety that can be there with interacting with our social support systems. And so sometimes we might get confused with social distancing versus physical distancing. And social distancing, we might be isolating ourselves socially and maybe not engaging with people, but it can be helpful to find ways to continue connecting with people, but maybe at a physically safe distance. And so a lot of this has looked like using Zoom or other video-based platforms to connect with people. And this could be maybe having a weekly hangout, or maybe just catching up with peers that you might be separated from right now. Playing board games through online platforms, or even apps like House Party or Kahoot. Watching television or movies, saying like, hey, at this time, let's watch this movie, or even this documentary, and kind of engaging each other in those things that we might normally do together. And of course, spending time outside, going on walks, having maybe socially distant picnics, and doing things like phone calls, texting, letter writing. So making sure that you're, during this time of social separation, that you're still engaging in social connection. And as we're thinking about advocacy, I've seen on social media this metaphor of considering it like a multi-lane highway. On this highway, we are all heading in the same direction of advocacy, social justice, equity, resolving the cultural traumas and the systems that are in place right now that are causing those. And there's a lot of lanes on this highway. Some forms of driving that highway might look like protests and being involved with protests. Sometimes that might look like signing petitions or watching documentaries or engaging in difficult conversations with family members, writing letters to government officials. And so it's important to make sure you're driving in the lane that feels right for you, because it can be dangerous to drive in all of the lanes. If you think about driving on a highway, we wouldn't want you driving all over the place. So it's important to know which highway feels right for you right now, checking in with yourself and what feels right. And also knowing that it's okay to switch lanes. We have a turn signal. So, you know, if one day you have more energy and you are like, you know what, I can go to the protest today, doing that. But then if you notice your energy kind of fading later in the week, knowing like, okay, maybe I need to turn my turn signal on and switch into a different lane of advocacy. And then knowing that while we're driving on a multi-lane highway, there are normally rest areas and stops along the way. So being sure to check in with yourself, knowing when you might need to take a break from the driving. And knowing that at these stops, there might be resources or things to help prepare you for the next part of the drive. So this could be checking in with our social relationships, or seeing a therapist, or just learning more. Or it could be taking a complete break from social media, something like that. And so again, we're all driving in the same direction to the same destination, but sometimes we have to check ourselves to make sure that we're not driving in the wrong direction. So constantly being vigilant about making sure that we are doing things that have an active role in supporting social justice. And sometimes that involves getting feedback from our peers. And using your GPS system on this highway. So considering your experiences and your values as part of your navigation system and allowing them to support you in driving towards the destination of social justice. And we'll talk about self-care. And Gayatri, I think that you were going to share a little bit about self-care.
Yes. Thanks, Blake. I had muted myself because of some static that I was hearing, so thanks for that. So I want to talk a little bit about self-care. And when we say self-care, we're referring to a practice where we take an active role in protecting our own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. So I want to emphasize on a couple of words here. One of the key words here is protecting. Often we wait for like things to go really bad, right? Like when we get really stressed and we're like, oh gosh, I got to practice self-care. But this is introducing us to the concept that we don't have to wait. We can start practicing self-care in our today, like right now, whatever we do, incorporate it in our daily life, because we are already experiencing so much stress. And if we're experiencing more stress, then maybe we need to rethink how much self-care we need to practice to be able to cope with that stress. So some of the things that we want to talk about are questions of, taking some time out and thinking what works for me. What resonates for me when I'm practicing self-care. And as we know, we cannot pour from an empty cup. We have to fill the cup first. And the good news is that the cup is refillable. So we have to find things that would fill our cup for us, and do things that can rejuvenate us, give us some passion, some energy. Um, it's also important to set boundaries in the kind of work we do sometimes, where we feel like we're giving and giving and listening, and we're exhausted. And so it's important sometimes you set boundaries so that you can take some time to take care of yourself. Because if you take care of yourself, then you can take care of somebody else. It's also important to take breaks. And sometimes we might have to take breaks during the day. Maybe we've had, a difficult conversation with somebody who's struggling, and we're exhausted from compassion fatigue, or we feel their pain deeply, and we need to take a few minutes, to reset our GPS, if you will. It's important also to plan our schedule. Sometimes we don't want to say no to people, or we don't want to disappoint them. And in that, we try to say, no, we'll do it. We'll talk to this one and this one and this one. But what happens is our schedule gets overwhelmed, and then we get overwhelmed. Self-care is also, maybe finding things that can keep you going, things that are humorous. Sometimes a sense of humor can help us cope with things that we don't have control over. It's also important to check in with yourself from time to time and see, do I need to practice more self-care? Have I done self-care this week? What am I waiting for? Is there a right day or time, or is this the right time to do that? Also, as advocates for the kind of work that we're talking about, it's important to assess how tired we are. And there is such a thing called compassion fatigue, which is we're exhausted trying to be compassionate, trying to be listening to people, and hearing them for their stories and for their pain. And finally, it's also important to focus on coping, with all the things that we're doing. And it really comes down to maybe just finding a way to balance. If we can't get rid of things, we can't get rid of certain stressors, maybe we can find a better way to balance how we deal with our stressors and our lives. So right at the onset, we had spent a little time introducing the concept of wellness and the 8 dimensions that make up our wellness. So we're going to just sort of share with you a little bit more about some concrete ideas on what these look like in these dimensions. So we'll go through it. So for example, the emotional dimension of wellness, how can we feel better in this area? Some of the things that we could do are write our feelings down, get in touch with our feelings, engage in activities that engage our 5 senses, maybe go for a walk, look at the sunset, hear some music. So those are some ways that we can expand our wellness on that continuum. In terms of the environmental dimension, cleaning our clutter, recycling, planting a garden are some ways that we can introduce more wellness in that category. In the financial dimension, it is useful sometimes to check our budgeting. Are we allocating funds where they need to be? Are we accessing resources that are available? For example, there's student discounts available, or there are different restaurants that give us good deals. Are we making the most of the resources that are offered to us? Have we saved some money? And so getting our financial matters a bit in order can make us feel better about ourselves and about our lives. In terms of the intellectual dimension, maybe practicing new skills, learning new hobbies, reading, watching a documentary, again, accessing resources that are available, asking for help if we need it from professors or people that can help us. The occupational dimension refers to what I was talking about earlier, where we do a sort of assessment of how much how hard we're working, and are we taking breaks? Are we taking time out? Are we balancing our work? And is our work truly meaningful to us? Are we passionate about our work? And it's also important to pay a little bit of attention to the relationships that we have at work. Are we cultivating those bonds? Are those bonds healing? Are they supportive of us? And how are we managing our workplace stress? Um, the next dimension is the physical dimension. And this is about us taking maybe more time to make good choices. The nutrition that we're putting in our bodies is important. Maybe we need to sleep a little bit more. Maybe we need to do something that gives us joy, maybe yoga or dancing. Also, in the time of COVID-19, we're hesitant, a lot of us, to go to doctors' offices. So maybe finding out what sort of opportunities are there that are safer. For example, telehealth appointments or teletherapy, where you don't have to go physically see somebody, but you can still take care of yourself using technology. The next dimension is social, which is important. You know, maybe calling up a friend you haven't spoken to, attending virtual events, you know, practicing boundaries, and also practicing our effective communication skills is important. And then finally, the spiritual dimension, which refers to, you know, how can we, amidst so much of sorrow and sadness and stress, can we find a way to maintain some sort of attitude of hope? And for some of us, we might want to do a little bit of self-reflection, of prayer or meditation, even connecting to your humanness, just whatever is meaningful can help contribute to how well we feel about ourselves.
So we have some resources listed for self-care. These are just a few, and these can be found on our website, as well as additional resources that pertain to social justice. We have some resources that are provided by the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as other resources that are related to racial trauma and social justice in our country, such as the Center for Healing Racial Trauma. So if you are interested in checking out some other resources, we have those on our website, and those can be supportive tools in your self-care toolbox. And earlier we've mentioned our services, so this can be a quick review of what we have available. So currently during COVID-19, we are offering phone-based consultation. So if you're interested in our services or getting started with our services, or you're interested in maybe a referral to other resources, or have questions about how to support someone else, you can schedule a phone consultation by calling us at 828-262-3180. And so we offer individual therapy through telemental health. We do have our emergency services updated. So if you check our website, there's more information there. And then if you are in the North Carolina area, we encourage people to check out crisisolutionsnc.org to find local crisis support. And if you are outside of North Carolina, there are resources such as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And additionally, such as this workshop, we have our quick access workshops and our entire Feeling Good series workshop. So be on the lookout for those throughout the summer. And we've updated our Let's Talk service to be Let's Teletalk via Zoom. And so that can be a way of just checking in with a counselor for about 15 to 20 minutes and maybe just processing an experience in an informal way, a brief setting. It's not a commitment to therapy, and it's not to be confused with therapy. It's just a way to maybe chat with a counselor, to talk through a situation, or to even get guidance on resources. And then in addition to all of that, we have our self-help resources, which can be found on our website.
Thank you, Blake. We wanted to do a 3-minute sort of activity of maybe some mindfulness and meditation. And so what we're going to ask, and we're going to do it with you, is we want you to find a comfortable position with your feet touching the ground. And whenever you're ready, close your eyes or find a place in the room to focus on, and whatever is comfortable for you. And then take a second or two to notice your breath and how it feels to be breathing in this moment. And we're going to play a little clip. So when that clip is playing, if you have thoughts that wander, that's okay. Just gently return to noticing your breath or the sound that you're hearing. And something that we ask people is when they breathe in, try to think of what would you like to receive when you're breathing in. Sometimes people say we want peace or we want more strength. And as you breathe out, think of maybe what you want to let go of, what you want to release. Maybe you want to release some stress or you want to put some fears aside for a few minutes. So we're going to play this, and if you could join us, and then in 3 minutes we will come back again.
So whenever you're ready, take a moment to return back to this space, return back to this presentation. You may notice yourself feeling a little more relaxed or sleepy, so If you need to yawn or do a little stretching right now, feel free to do so. We're going to return to this presentation and we are going to finish up. So thank you for Gayatri for introducing us to that practice, and we appreciate you attending this workshop. We said our names are Gayatri and Blake, and we are at the Counseling Center, so give us a call or an email if you have any questions. We do have an evaluation that we would really appreciate you taking some time to fill out, just to help us better understand how we can shape this workshop or continue providing support to students. And if you are attending this for extra credit from a professor, there will be some questions on the evaluation sheet that'll ask you to provide your email so that we can email that attendance verification. But that will be it. And we appreciate you coming in. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to stop the